What happened here? Germany is filled with places where almost no one lives today. Old factories, abandoned train stations, barracks, and entire villages hiding in plain sight. The history of these spaces is actively disappearing. Witnesses grow older, paper documents are lost, and eventually bulldozers arrive to erase what little physical evidence remains. To understand what actually took place, we have to treat these locations like forensic sites. We have to stop looking at the giant empty shells of the buildings and start looking closely at the tiny, abandoned artifacts left inside. A rusted locker, a faded house number, a calendar stuck permanently on a specific Tuesday in 1989. These details bridge the gap between a modern ruin and the life that filled it. Following these small clues reveals a version of Germany's past that isn't curated for a museum display. It is the unpolished, leftover evidence of how life was actually lived. Massive infrastructure doesn't die by accident. These facilities collapse under the weight of sudden, sweeping economic or political shifts. This photograph captures a dense, heavy industrial plant. The sheer scale of the smokestacks and structures proves the immense size of this production hub. Yet, changing global markets hollowed out facilities exactly like this one. Political decisions can render vast infrastructure useless overnight. This photograph shows the layered fences and isolated guard tower of a heavy border zone, a severe, impenetrable boundary made obsolete by a single treaty. The ultimate catalyst is seen here, a man physically dismantling the Berlin Wall. When it fell, the logic holding these facilities together vanished, leaving thousands of state-run factories and schools completely redundant. Behind every padlock on an abandoned building is a macro-level decision that sealed the fate of the community within it. Every site has a specific tipping point. Seen in this photo of a steam train and rail bus, there is a final day of logistics. The last trains depart, the workers leave, and the heavy metal doors are finally locked. Then, the second life begins. Rain breaches a neglected roof. Water seeps into tiny concrete fissures. As winter temperatures drop, that water freezes, expanding and splintering the stone from the inside out. Nature systematically dismantles the human engineering. Moss swallows the walls, and root systems push through brick and steel over decades of quiet growth. This relentless physical decay traps a specific era of human design beneath the moss and silt, leaving it to rot exactly where it was abandoned. We must look past the decaying architecture and focus on the humans. These were vibrant environments where people worked, argued, and built futures they thought were secure. In this photo of a populated assembly line, you see the focus of the working class, whose daily routines vanished alongside the factory. The collapse claimed social structures too. This image shows eager students in a crowded classroom. Entire generations were raised in institutions that no longer exist. Societies naturally prefer perfectly restored monuments, but polished tourist landmarks only reflect the sanitized history a country wants to project to the world. To find the unvarnished truth of a nation's past, you have to look away from the gleaming statues. You have to walk into the quiet, empty rooms of its forgotten places. Travel through Germany today, and you will eventually find them. The decaying husks of former hospitals, military barracks, and industrial halls scattered across the landscape. A collapsed roof or a shattered window typically signals the end of a building's functional life. The structure begins a slow, quiet descent into the background. Look closer, and you'll find that these walls are still holding on to the specific remnants of the lives once lived inside them. The traces are everywhere. A rusted locker left open, a 1992 calendar on a wall, a nameplate for a missing supervisor. These small, lingering details provide the first clues to a larger mystery. They force us to ask what actually happened in these rooms and why the world these people built was eventually abandoned to the dust. To understand that disappearance, we have to look at the site of the German industrial factory, starting with something as small as a discarded pair of work gloves. For decades, this hall vibrated with a deafening roar. Massive machinery ran relentlessly, cutting metal and processing coal in an environment of extreme physical intensity. Amid that massive scale were individual people. For these workers, the factory floor defined their daily routine, providing a steady income, lifelong colleagues, and a deep sense of personal identity. That identity shaped the entire landscape. A production plant functioned as the primary economic anchor for a town, with generations of families living in homes built directly in the shadow of the chimneys. Every morning and afternoon, a massive surge of humanity passed through these gates, hundreds of workers arriving by bus and bicycle, setting the rhythm for the shops, the pubs, and the heartbeat of the whole region. Because a factory was the literal lifeblood of its community, its closure represented far more than a corporate decision. It was a severe, localized social catastrophe. The forces that trigger that collapse are usually invisible from the factory floor. They arrive as shifting global production costs, or new technologies, or even sudden political divisions that abruptly sever those long-established supply chains. Eventually, those pressures lead to a final day of operation. The machines are powered down. The last shift ends. Workers pack what they can carry and go home for the last time. The economic ripple effect hits the surrounding town almost immediately. Local businesses lose their reliable customer base. Neighborhoods empty out as the younger generation leaves the region in search of work elsewhere. Back at the facility, the mechanics of decay take over. Rainwater seeps through unpatched roofs. Expanding winter frost cracks solid brick walls. Roots push their way upward through the concrete foundations. Nature reclaims the footprint. A space engineered for vital, high-volume production slowly transitions into a passive monument to its own demise. History textbooks excel at recording the big picture, the trade treaties, the national GDP, and the shifting borders. But they often overlook the tactile, daily experience of the people living through those events. That intimate historical data survives only in these ruins. It is found in the remnants of 8-hour shifts, heavily worn tools, personal notes, and the simple, profound feeling of being needed. This unique record is fragile. Every year, more of these sites are demolished for new development. Weather erases the remaining artifacts, and the former workers who hold the living memory grow older. A government statistic records the year a business closed. An abandoned room shows the human void left behind. These ruins stand as the final, irreplaceable physical archives of the 20th century's everyday citizens. They are the last places where their story remains written in the walls, and they are fading. We usually picture vanishing towns as victims of sudden, violent events, an earthquake, a flood, a war. But across rural Germany, a different kind of erasure is happening. It creeps in slowly, year by year, without making a sound. One person moves away. Then a whole family packs up. A few years later, neighbors follow. There is no single catastrophic event to point to, only a steady, quiet thinning of the population. A village operates like a complex machine held together by daily human friction. When you slowly remove the people, that machine loses its tension, and the entire structure eventually collapses under its own weight. The draining of these towns began in the mid-20th century, driven by sheer efficiency. As agriculture became mechanized, farms that once required dozens of workers could be managed by a single machine, leaving massive rural labor surpluses. Simultaneously, post-war industries were rapidly expanding. Factories in the cities needed massive workforces, offering reliable wages and regular hours that farm life could not match. With the rise of affordable cars and a growing push for university education, younger generations found it easier than ever to leave. And once they left for school or a corporate job, they rarely came back. The modern economy engineered a permanent outward pull. It steadily extracted the young, working-age demographic required to keep any rural ecosystem functioning. When a population decks below a certain mathematical threshold, a chain reaction starts. It only takes a few empty houses to trigger the first major institutional failures. Without a steady influx of young families, the student body shrinks. Soon, the district decides the numbers do not add up, and the local school shuts down. Next, the customer base drops too low for local commerce to survive. The general store boards up its windows. Then, with fewer commuters, the regional bus stops coming through entirely. Losing these places meant losing the nervous system of the town. The school and the store were where information flowed, where people intersected and checked in on one another. The architecture remains standing for decades, but the community itself dies right here in these first few years, the moment its meeting points vanish. Look at these massive farmhouses. They were built to shelter multiple generations under one roof, along with their livestock and winter harvests. Now they sit completely vacant. Without daily maintenance, the elements quickly find their way in. A few missing shingles let water seep into the attic. Wooden support beams begin to rot, and the window panes crack from shifting foundations. By the 10-year mark, the property lines blur. The grass grows unchecked, wild brush chokes out the old vegetable gardens, and the yard becomes an impassable thicket. Give it half a century, and the forest swallows the lot. Tree roots tear through the masonry, consuming what used to be a living room. As the silhouette vanishes, its purpose disappears. Where there was once a kitchen door, there is only a cluster of saplings and a pile of moss-covered brick. When we walk past these crumbling walls today, our instinct is to view them as eerie anomalies, divorced from any human context. But you have to mentally rebuild the space. Picture a child running across the courtyard. Imagine a mother hanging laundry out on the line in the afternoon sun. Think of two neighbors spending hours mending a fence line together, or a family sitting around the kitchen table at night, quietly debating the upcoming harvest. In an era without high-speed internet, automated machinery, or a supermarket down the street, your survival depended on the people immediately around you. Your neighbor was a necessary lifeline. These rotting timbers and bricks mark the extinction of a deeply interdependent social ecosystem. This was a way of living defined by a constant reliance on one's immediate neighbors, a bond that modern convenience has made obsolete. When we think about places disappearing, we usually picture something dramatic: a war, a natural disaster, an event that wipes a town off the map overnight. But there is another way places vanish. Across rural Germany, entire villages have disappeared. No bombs, no floods. They simply faded away, year by year, person by person. Which leaves us with a physical mystery. How exactly does a busy, multi-generational neighborhood turn back into a wild forest? The answer lies in what you could call the cascade of abandonment. Long before a single roof caves in or a wooden beam starts to rot, the community inside those walls has to break apart first. The sequence starts with a shift in how we farm. For centuries, agriculture required massive workforces. Then, machines like these took over the fields. Heavy tractors replaced human labor, stripping away the economic reason for many to stay. Without local jobs, the younger generations looked elsewhere. They packed onto trains heading for the cities, drawn by the promise of university degrees, specialized training, and modern careers. At the same time, owning a personal car became common. Leaving wasn't an impossible journey anymore. The geographical ties that had kept families in the exact same zip code for hundreds of years simply dissolved. The village was no longer a strict economic necessity, and with that, the slow, unstoppable bleed of the local population began. It starts quietly. One young adult moves away, then a whole family packs up. At first, the remaining residents might barely notice, but each departure pulls a little more money out of the local economy, pushing the town closer to a mathematical tipping point. Eventually, the numbers stop working. The local grocery store loses too many customers and has to lock its doors. The village school drops below the minimum enrollment and shuts down. Even the regional bus stop sits empty. To understand why this is fatal, you have to remember how these places operated. Before the internet, before everyone could drive 30 minutes to a giant supermarket, you were entirely reliant on your immediate neighbors. The church and the general store functioned as the town's central nervous system. They were places for children to play, hubs for local news, and the literal social glue that kept people connected. The physical buildings might still be standing, but their function is gone. Without those gathering places, the invisible social structure of the village collapses entirely. With the people gone, the timeline of physical decay takes over. These are massive, multi-generational farmhouses built to shelter families and livestock. Now they sit completely empty. Without regular maintenance, water always finds a way in. Missing shingles let the rain through, the roof starts to leak, and the heavy support beams rot. After a decade, the manicured gardens grow wild. Weeds overtake the pathways, and fences disappear into thickets, though you can still make out the faint geometric lines of human design. But by year 20, the dynamic changes. Nature stops merely growing around the house and begins to actively dismantle it. Roots crack the foundations, and vines pull apart the brickwork. Half a century in, the transformation is complete. The property is entirely reclaimed. What used to be a neatly paved courtyard and a bustling family home is now entirely indistinguishable from a small forest. The collapsing roof and the shattered windows are just the final symptoms. Nature is finishing the demolition that the social collapse started decades earlier. This extreme physical decay tricks our brains. When we walk past these overgrown sites today, we don't naturally picture a living, breathing home. All we register is a creepy ruin. To really understand what was lost here, we have to mentally reconstruct the space. We have to strip away the ivy and bring back the deep, radical normalcy of the place. Picture a child running across the cobblestones on a Tuesday afternoon. Imagine a farmer out by the property line, carefully repairing a broken fence before the sun goes down. Think of the endless, ordinary domestic labor. Someone hauling a heavy basket outside to hang wet laundry in the summer sun, week after week. Inside, multiple generations of a family gathered around a kitchen table at night. They ate dinner, argued over the harvest yields, and gossiped. The history of these vanished villages is entirely devoid of grand battles or famous treaties. The story of these spaces was written in the quiet, steady rhythm of daily routine. When we stare at an abandoned village, we shouldn't view it as a failure. We are looking at a monument to a vanished way of life, a permanent reminder of the incredibly delicate social fabric required to keep any community alive today. If you walk through these fields today, you'll find rows of identical two-story buildings slowly disappearing into the brush. Look closely, and the ghosts of a rigidly organized world are still there. You can spot faded numbers stenciled on the walls, wide concrete avenues leading nowhere, empty motor pools, and silent administrative hubs. It is quiet now, but for decades, these exact coordinates were among the most heavily armed and intensely monitored environments on the planet. So how does a landscape designed to host the epicenter of global military tension end up as an overgrown, forgotten ghost town? To understand these ruins, we have to look at them as fossils. They are the physical remains of a massive, sudden geopolitical shift that left them stranded in time. For a huge portion of the 20th century, Germany was the literal physical fault line between two opposing global political systems. Following the Second World War, the country was sliced down the middle. The Federal Republic aligned west, the Democratic Republic formed east. This invisible line quickly hardened, evolving into a highly fortified physical barrier tearing the nation in half. On the ground, that line looked like this: miles of sheer concrete walls, lethal anti-tank traps, and a constant unblinking network of surveillance. Ordinary German forests and rolling hills were entirely re-engineered. They became the absolute front line for a potential Third World War. The abstract tension of the global Cold War left a massive physical footprint across the German landscape. Maintaining a state of readiness required a staggering amount of infrastructure. Vast tracts of land were cleared for sprawling barracks, immense training grounds, towering radio arrays, and massive vehicle halls. Beneath the surface, the preparations went even further. Deep underground bunkers like this one were carved out, fully equipped to sustain operations through a catastrophic first strike. For the thousands of soldiers stationed here, life was defined by a relentless, exhausting cycle of combat training and equipment maintenance. While governments in distant capitals played a complex game of geopolitical chess, the individuals on the ground experienced a highly regimented, isolated existence, often completely sealed off from neighboring civilian towns. It was a state of suspended anticipation. It took an immense psychological and logistical toll to remain perfectly prepared to deploy at a moment's notice, every single day, for decades. In these border districts, the military mission dictated the use of the land and the pace of life, turning the countryside into a specialized engine of suspended war. Then, the dynamic suddenly collapsed. The military tension that had defined the global era evaporated almost overnight. This created an immediate logistical problem. This colossal infrastructure was designed for exactly one highly specific political scenario. The moment that scenario disappeared, the bases lost their primary reason for existing. The dismantling process was remarkably fast. Military units were formally dissolved, massive fleets of vehicles were loaded onto trains and shipped away, and the once bustling barracks were permanently shuttered. Thousands of soldiers packed up their belongings and waited for transport. They abandoned the installations that had been their entire regimented world. Complexes that consumed billions of dollars and decades of labor to construct became empty concrete shells in a matter of months. The sheer specialization of these sites, from bunker ventilation to reinforced hangars, made them instantly redundant. Without the specific enemy they were designed to face, the mechanism was left without a purpose. Which brings us back to the silent, overgrown complexes we see today. We can now recognize them as obsolete, defunct artifacts of a deeply paranoid era. Architectural remnants like these massive watchtowers were built to project absolute human power, constant surveillance, and unyielding control over the landscape. Now, entropy and nature are slowly dismantling the exact structures that opposing armies prepared for decades to fight over. Environments painstakingly designed for peak human organization and total destruction find themselves completely defenseless against the quiet encroachment of moss and vines. The immense, terrifying buildup of the Cold War never culminated in the predicted fire of battle. Instead, it ended in sudden silence, leaving behind concrete ruins that the forest is steadily erasing. If you walk through the German countryside today, you'll pass miles of dense green forests, quiet dirt paths, and perfectly empty fields. To a tourist or someone born after 1990, this landscape looks completely unremarkable. It is easy to look around and assume this open, peaceful scenery has always been the default state of the country. For decades, a patch of dirt exactly like this one marked the absolute edge of a person's world, a line that dictated where they could live, work, and travel. We treat a unified Germany as a given today, Yet the physical evidence of a deeply fractured, heavily guarded nation is still hiding right under the brush. You just have to know how to read the landscape. If you look closely at the undergrowth, you might spot an unnatural anomaly, like a perfectly straight line of decaying concrete cutting through the trees. This exposed rebar and rotting concrete are the physical remnants of the political divide that split the country in two. Society has moved on, and nature is doing its best to swallow the concrete. But these stubborn physical scars are the only things keeping this era from disappearing completely into the soil. This image shows how the border was engineered, a deeply layered military zone, packed with anti-vehicle obstacles stretching to distant watchtowers. Notice the wide death strips between fences, where forests were leveled to give guards unobstructed sightlines. And those sightlines were constantly manned. Armed guards scrutinized every movement through heavy mesh fences, creating a daily environment steeped to high anxiety and perpetual suspicion. For the people living right on the edge, the emotional toll was immense. Families could see the roofs of neighboring villages just a few hundred meters away, completely cut off by an impassable barrier. This entire apparatus was engineered to send a specific message. It was designed to look absolutely permanent and utterly terrifying to anyone who even thought about crossing it. But the end of this heavily fortified zone didn't come from a foreign army or a military invasion. In 1989, it fell to a rapid, grassroots political collapse that essentially happened overnight. Almost immediately, ordinary citizens and heavy machinery began tearing down the exact concrete slabs that had imprisoned them for decades. The transition happened with startling speed. Roads that had been sealed for decades opened, and civilian traffic began rolling right past signs for Checkpoint Charlie. Highly trained border guards were suddenly standing around with no orders. Massive, intensely secure control buildings lost their function in the blink of an eye. Once the orders stopped coming and the crowds moved in, millions of tons of reinforced concrete lost their authority in a single night. Today, you can still find massive border checkpoints that weren't demolished in the 90s. They were simply walked away from. These wide lanes and glass booths were once sites of intense, anxiety-inducing document checks. Now they sit completely empty, weathering away like modern ghost towns. While rural outposts weather away, urban sections of the wall are maintained as sterile museum pieces, surrounded by everyday traffic. Whether they're left to rot in a field or preserved as a memorial downtown, these structures act as a physical timeline. They show exactly how fast absolute authority decays into a historical curiosity. For decades, taking a single unauthorized step across this specific landscape meant certain imprisonment, or worse. Now you can take a dog for a walk, go for a hike, or ride a bike directly across the very same terrain. This shift from a guarded, militarized zone to an open path highlights how quickly physical barriers can become obsolete in the face of historical change. Give it enough time, and the most imposing walls humans can build will all eventually crumble into a quiet, overgrown, perfectly unspectacular landscape. At its peak, an active train station operates like a massive, highly tuned machine, engineered exclusively to keep human beings in constant motion. Look at the sheer volume of a platform operating at capacity. You have tens of thousands of people funneling through these arches every single day, creating a relentless cycle of arrivals and departures. But this overwhelming energy is built entirely around the schedule. The second a train pulls away, the physical space loses its immediate purpose, sitting quietly until the next locomotive rolls in. So we have to ask, what happens to that architectural machine when the next train simply never arrives? Across the modern transit map, you can find these forgotten outposts. Buildings like this one, sitting silently next to cracked pavement, completely stripped of their original utility. Every overgrown rail and boarded-up window here documents a world that eventually chose to move around them. The platform is the first place to look. It was the concrete stage where the actual friction of human transition happened. On any given morning, this specific patch of ground held local factory workers waiting for the early commute, standing right alongside students traveling to neighboring cities for school. It also acted as a physical point of severance. This is where communities absorbed the heavy weight of farewells, marking the exact spot where families split apart during times of conflict or major life changes. Conversely, it was the site of return. Travelers returning home from abroad or orgs mapping entirely new routes would interact right here at the edge of the cars. When this platform closed, those daily rituals, the student's trip, the worker's commute, simply stopped happening here. The town's focus shifted away from its center, forced to look toward the distant highway instead. If we follow the rusted, overgrown tracks away from the platform, we hit a broader economic question. Why did the network sever this connection? Part of the answer lies directly overhead. As the automobile took over, governments poured resources into massive highway systems that easily bypassed these intricate local rail lines. This diagram illustrates a concept called network efficiency. It's a modern transit philosophy that prioritizes rapid movement between major urban hubs, rather than maintaining comprehensive access to every small town. As national timetables became mathematically optimized for speed, slowing down a high-capacity train for a handful of rural passengers became an unacceptable cost in time and fuel. The physical consequence of this math is that local tracks are officially decommissioned and physically removed from the grid. So those rusted rails ending in the weeds aren't natural decay. They are visible artifacts of a deliberate, systemic choice to value national speed over local connection. Back inside the station, you'll often find a blank wall or an empty glass case where the timetable used to live. Look at the sheer volume of information on an active schedule like this one. For a town, appearing in this matrix of complex data is literal proof of existence on the map. When a community's name is erased from the master schedule, it loses its guaranteed link to the broader economy. Without that scheduled arrival, the station's utility vanishes entirely. The building is trapped in amber, while the rest of the country accelerates past it. Zooming out, we see the station standing quietly in the landscape it was originally built to serve. A station exists to be a link. Once that connection is gone, the town is no longer part of the map's active geometry, left to find a new identity in isolation. So, the next time you drive past one of these boarded-up platforms, try to see past the decay. You are looking at a ghost of motion, a direct link back to a period when this specific route mattered. These quiet ruins stand as heavy, architectural monuments to how human mobility actually worked. They mark the end of a time when our connections to one another moved at a much more deliberate pace. When we look at an abandoned space, we tend to stop at the physical surface. We see the heavy metal rusting away, the thick vines creeping across cracked glass, and the way time slowly reclaims the architecture. We look at sprawling, rusted industrial skeletons silhouetted against the sky, and we feel the sheer scale of the emptiness. That emptiness creates a quiet vacuum. Modern internet culture fills that silence with sensationalized myths, ghost stories, and the promise of dark, hidden secrets. However, the events that actually define a building's past rarely leave a visible mark on the brick and iron. To find the real history, we have to look for what cannot be photographed. To understand the actual significance of these decaying structures, we have to look past the physical walls and uncover the lives that used to operate inside them. Historians rely on official archives, but human memory provides a depth that paper records frequently overlook. Official city documents show you what a building was zoned for or how its plumbing was laid out, but official paperwork cannot document the daily routine, the deafening noise, or the distinct atmosphere of actually being inside. A retired mechanic remembers exactly how this Volkswagen assembly line roared to life at 6 a.m. He recalls the smell of the grease, the intense heat, and the shoulder-to-shoulder rhythm of building those early cars. A former student can look at a hollowed-out room and recall the vibrant dynamic of a 1950s classroom. She knows exactly where her friends sat and how the teacher's voice bounced off the blackboard. These everyday recollections act as vital historical records. They restore the necessary human context to an empty shell. Yet, relying on personal memory introduces a serious complication. Human memory is messy, highly subjective, and frequently contradictory. This factory blueprint splits into two realities when we map lived experiences. One worker recalls a tight-knit community, while another remembers a monotonous cage. The same splintering happens in a school blueprint, dividing it into a haven of friends or a space of deep anxiety. Two people can occupy the exact same physical coordinates and live entirely conflicting truths. History rarely offers us a clean black and white narrative. An abandoned building acts as a complex vessel, holding layers of beautiful and painful human realities at the exact same time. If we step back from these deeply personal recollections, we can examine the overarching factual reasons why these places fell empty. The vast majority of these sites transition from active use to silence without a single dramatic tragedy or hidden conspiracy. The actual cause of decay is almost stubbornly ordinary. Buildings die from shifting supply chains, from bureaucratic consolidation, or dry economic downturns. Accepting that ordinary reality gives us a far better tool for understanding the past. It shows us the mechanics of how society actually operates. An industrial complex turns into a rust bucket when a regional manufacturer can no longer compete globally and files for bankruptcy. Local clinics locked their doors because modern healthcare models merged them into larger, centralized hospital networks. Sprawling military barracks lie entirely vacant today because geopolitical strategies shifted during peacetime, eliminating the need to house local troops. Bustling train stations that saw thousands of commuters are now boarded up because young populations moved to cities, draining rural villages. Every single locked door, overgrown parking lot, and shattered window is a specific data point. Connect enough of them together, and you build a complete map of systemic, nationwide change. These vacant sites represent the physical footprints of a nation evolving over time. They are the evidence of how Germany and modern society continues to move forward. A functioning society cannot sit still. To survive, a city has to constantly rewrite its own geography, tearing up the old foundations to pull the new ones upward. Look at the sprawling physical footprint of a modern economy. Keeping a country moving requires an endless assembly line of new transit hubs, residential districts, and corporate headquarters. But the math of urban development is a zero-sum game. Before the next iteration of a neighborhood can be built, the previous one has to be aggressively cleared out. When those walls come down, they take something invisible with them. The daily routines, the local context, and the memory of the people who actually lived there simply evaporate. Constant rebuilding is a requirement for survival. However, the unchecked cost of this development is the permanent, quiet erasure of the human experiences that once gave those spaces meaning. This is why abandoned places hold so much value. These sites function as rapid decay time capsules, preserving the specific evidence of our recent evolution. Look past the rust, and you find massive engines of economic utility. Decades ago, this exact floor space required thousands of hands meticulously assembling the tools that drove an entire industry forward. Consider the volume of daily life that once moved through these obsolete hubs. A forgotten rail platform was once a nexus of constant motion, processing thousands of daily commutes and reunions. Even an empty ward tells a story of ambition. At the time it was built, this room represented the absolute cutting edge of medical care and technological optimism. Zooming in from the macro institutions, these decaying structures eventually lead to the deeply intimate, private routines of the generations who grew up inside them. Stepping over a ruined staircase or unlatching a rusted gate is an act of forensic investigation. You are walking into spaces that were once entirely saturated with profound human decisions, intense fears, and hopes. Which brings us to a logistical problem. How can a society physically modernize without losing the conceptual meaning of the spaces it destroys? This chart shows the relationship between memory and time. Undocumented history follows a steep, rapid trajectory toward total loss, but active documentation arrests that decay and projects the record forward. Securing that data takes deliberate work. It requires compiling photographs, filming physical layouts, and recording interviews, and simply sitting down to listen to the people who survived those eras. Once you extract and secure that narrative, you create a failsafe. At that, you cannot freeze time, and you cannot stop the bulldozers. But by writing it down, you translate a doomed physical location into a permanent historical record. Ultimately, the past does not simply vanish into thin air. It aggressively changes its physical and cultural form. Consider the most extreme transitions a society can endure. The raw, violent devastation of a military conflict eventually cools over decades, transforming into quiet historical ruins. Or look at the fractured political realities of a divided nation, where ideological borders can rise up in a matter of months and redefine the entire geography of a city. Yet those long, traumatic divisions can be shattered by tectonic political shifts that rewrite the societal rules overnight and bring people back into the streets. Every lost place represents the exact intersection where a tangible physical memory transitions into an intangible history. You probably drive past these transitions on your daily commute. The next time you see an overgrown lot or a broken window down your street, realize that you are looking at a hidden chapter of a world that used to be completely normal. The decay of a building is inevitable, but forgetting is a choice. A place is never truly lost until humanity stops asking, "What happened here?"